Well, I think as a company, you're always trying to differentiate yourself from your competition. Becoming a certified firm gives you that opportunity. It says, I'm taking my business to a higher level. I have technicians that are certified in multiple areas. You have the opportunity to advertise that you're a certified firm, and there's a toolbox out there that the IICRC has that allows you to get further education for your employees, and again, to help people find you as a certified firm. As a consumer, I would want to look for somebody that has the proper insurance, that has trained technicians in the field that you're actually having the work done, and a certified firm does that for you. So as a customer, I approach a certified firm. I'm getting those technicians that are trained. As a technician, it's knowing that my owner is actually going to further educate me in the areas that I'm going to be working in.
There's more and more things that the IICRC continues to keep adding on. The marketing toolkit is one of the great resources for people to be able to use, see what things that they can use within their organization. There's also discounts that certain organizations, insurance companies, that give you credit for if you are a certified firm, because that, once again, they know that they're insuring a professional individual or company.
I want to take a moment starting here to say hello to our virtual audience. We have almost over 180 people joining us live that registered online to view this session with Pete. So welcome to our virtual audience. They are also going to be able to participate in the Q&A at the end of this if we have some time for questions. And thank you very much to the IICRC for being the sponsor of this broadcasting live session. So this session with Pete Duncanson does come straight from the headlines. It was 1 year ago this week that 58 people were killed in the mass shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. Sadly, similar incidents are becoming more and more prevalent in the U.S. and around the globe, and that means that our industry really needs to know how to do trauma and crime scene cleanup. So IIC Board Chairman Pete Duncanson is taking over the podium for the session on how to lay out and implement a disaster response program in the growing field of trauma and crime scene cleanup. This includes some discussion on the S540 trauma and crime scene cleanup standard. Please help me welcome Pete to the stage.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Let me make sure I'm working. There we go. You know, and I appreciate the introduction, and as she said it during the introduction, 1 year ago this past weekend was the tragedy in Las Vegas. And that especially hits home for the folks at the IICRC, because that's where our offices are. We have people that are our staff is there. We have about 30 employees in our building, and as the news came across the country of this mass shooting, for me, first thought was, were any of our employees impacted? Well, whether they were in the stands, whether they were at the concert, they were impacted because the city was impacted. We as a country were impacted. And we were just at the IICRC. We had our annual meetings this past weekend in Las Vegas. And on Monday was the anniversary. Took a few moments to remember that time. And I think it's something that's important. As this impacts all of us, we have to keep in mind who's impacted, not just this is another cleaning job. Because it is for some of us, but there are people that are personally impacted. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As was said, I'm the chairman of the board for the IICRC. I'm beginning my 4th year as chairman of the board, my 9th year, I believe it is, on the board of directors. I've been honored to serve. Been in the restoration industry a little over 33 years. Started out as a technician on a cleaning crew. Actually, before that, even in college, doing cleaning, and then on to owning a business, and have spent many years in the industry working for ServiceMaster. I'm currently the director of commercial operations. I know that says business operations, but I'm actually director of commercial operations for our commercial recovery team in ServiceMaster. So we're going to talk about kind of the process of biohazard losses, what goes on. We're going to spend a little bit of time reviewing the claim, and from that I mean We're going to talk about the insurance side of it, what the insurance folks look at and some of the concerns. Now, I am not an insurance professional. I'm not an adjuster, but I've spent some time working on these presentations with other folks at PLRB, et cetera, and pulled some information related to the insurance claim and some of the things that they are most concerned about. We're going to talk about our standard and the expectations, talk about the IICRC standard called the S540, which is the crime and trauma cleanup standard. And I'm actually going to give away a few copies of that standard. So pay attention, okay? Good questions or the right answer gets you a copy of the standard. Richard Green, who's the president of the IICRC, a full-time staff member, is here, and his job is to keep track of when I say you just want a standard. Got that, Richard? Okay. And those of you on the phone or on live, I'm sorry, there's no way for you to win a standard. Next time you'll have to be in the room. Anytime I do a session related to trauma, biohazard, that sort of thing, I do like to give my disclaimer. There are some pictures that are used that are either owned by ServiceMaster, used with permission, etc. But some of them can be very disturbing. So I like to forewarn people. I won't dwell on pictures. I will tell you there's no pictures of bodies, that sort of thing. But I do like to give a little heads up in case somebody has a problem. Hopefully in this industry, you don't have a problem seeing some of these pictures, because if you do, it's going to be very difficult for you to do this type of work. But you know what? We do have to keep in mind that you can do this time and time and time again, and then one time it's going to trigger a different memory or a different emotion with you or your technicians, the people doing the work on a daily basis, and it may impact you differently. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk about the emotional side as well. All right, so when we talk about a biohazard loss, now obviously we think of the mass traumas, shootings, those types of things, but a biohazard loss doesn't have to be that large. It can be something as simple as a nosebleed on a basketball floor. I've got 4 children that are all grown. I've got 8 grandchildren. My boys played soccer, played basketball. They were very athletic, okay, unlike their father. So Michael's right, the jokes just don't work in here, okay? Okay? It's all right to laugh at me, okay? But I remember my son in junior high getting hit in the nose on a basketball game. Just, a little elbow in the nose, something like that. He probably deserved it, okay? Blood. What happened? Somebody grabbed a towel, wiped it up, and took that towel and threw it back in the basket. Okay? Today, when you watch basketball or soccer or anything like that, football games, somebody gets hit in the nose, there's blood on the court, there's blood on the field, whatever it is, there's a special bag that comes out. The person puts on gloves. They use a special disinfectant. They clean it up differently, and they remove those towels and those cleanup items to a different area. Our little elementary school where my sons went, they just threw that towel back in the basket with all the rest, and what happens a little while later, somebody's probably grabbing that and wiping sweat off their face. It's not the way we need to do things today. We need to keep in mind what's happening. We're going to talk about not only blood, but then there is OPIM. Okay. Without reading the screen, can somebody tell me what OPIM stands for? Other potentially infectious materials. That's correct. Now, if you go to OSHA's website, as they list out OPIM and all the potential bodily fluids that could be in OPIM, okay? It's safe to say, basically, if it's a bodily fluid, consider that it's probably going to be hazardous. Yeah, there's some that they don't list, but if you're not really sure, is there a doctor in the room? Are any of you doctors? Can any of you identify those fluids just by sight? Please not by taste, okay? So let's make sure you just assume that everything is potentially infectious. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in today. Okay? We have to make assumptions. Oftentimes we're called in to do biohazard losses because of suicides or homicides, unattended deaths, But what about animals? Okay. Ever had a raccoon in the attic? Who, a little mama raccoon gets up in the attic, bores in, makes a little nest, gives birth. Okay. All of a sudden you look up one day and there's a stain on the ceiling. Gee, I wonder why we have a stain on our ceiling. Oh, fluids from the raccoons. Are those biohazards? Yeah, those are all treated like biohazards. There's a whole segment of that. What about bats? Mice, rats, all the feces, all those animal byproducts as well, all fall into this biohazard area that we have to deal with. So don't just think of the mass trauma, industrial accidents, those types of things. Keep in mind all the other potentially infectious situations like animals. Michael talked about hurricanes earlier. That was always one of the concerns we had going into hurricane cleanups. Where are the animals? And sometimes the animals get washed up and they can't get out. Then they die, and now we have carcasses to deal with. That's still a biohazard. All right, so we're going to go through, and this is, again, my disclaimer, my warning of some of the pictures. You look at a job like this, you can see that steel caging there. See the sign that says employees only hanging down in the lower right-hand corner to you? That's a gun store, okay? Someone broke into the store in the middle of the night, and in the process of breaking in, cut themselves. Ran around the store trying to get to all the guns, and they were probably, high on something and didn't realize what they were doing. But as they ran around that store, they bled out. Okay? Never got through the cage to the guns, but the blood did. Now there's blood everywhere. So what became a robbery now became a biohazard cleanup. Okay? Different case. These are the front doors to a church. All that blood you see there is from a deer. A deer jumped through a window in what was the library of this small church, came out of the library, turned left, saw the front doors, ran to the front doors to try and get out, and jumped up on the front doors and sprayed blood all over the place, because when it jumped through the window, it cut itself across the abdomen. Now this was a very conscientious deer, because it ran back down the hallway, turned back into the library, and jumped out the same window, because it was found 10 feet outside the church, dead. But now there's a trail of blood down this hall that now has to be cleaned up. Okay, is that a biohazard? Absolutely. Okay. That's the same job. Look at the carpet. And if you look closely, there's actually a piece of antler laying there on the floor as well, where this buck, this was in Michigan, not far from where Michael's from, down outside of Lansing, Michigan, actually, in late October. The irony was I had just been teaching a trauma class and just finished when the business I was teaching for got the phone call about this job. So we got to go do a real life cleanup. It was fun. Okay. What about this one? Can you tell what's in that tub other than the shampoo bottles? Okay. That's waste. Human waste. Now, your first thought is, oh, it's a sewage job. Well, it's a lot more than a sewage job, because this was an apartment complex. There were 3 buildings, basement, first floor, second floor, third floor, and the basements had apartments in them as well. The buildings were built on a slight hill. This was the lowest building. This was one of the basement apartments. And all the sewage from all 3 buildings had been backing up into these apartments for over a month before the building owner was finally forced to clean it up. Okay. Now, The nice thing about this, it happened in February, so it was cold outside. This was up in Chicago. So it was nice and cold, so you didn't have the heat just making everything smell, except there were boilers. It was a hot water boiler system in this complex. Lowest building, this is where the boilers were. Those apartments were always 85 degrees. So not only did we have a biohazard, what else do you think we had growing? Green and fuzzy, mold everywhere. Okay? But it's a biohazard that had to be, the health department actually got involved and told this property manager they had to move everybody out of all 3 buildings until this was cleaned up. Okay? And the property manager gave us 24 hours to clean it up. Okay? We were there for 2.5 weeks. Okay? Billing them in 24-hour increments to make sure that we got paid, because we didn't think he'd pay us. Okay? But those occur all the time. There we go. And unfortunately, these occur as well. I'll give you a second to try and identify that pattern on the couch. Okay? So an individual would decide to take his own life. Okay? And then unfortunately, wasn't discovered for several days. So now what's contaminated when you start thinking about this particular incident? Not only the couch, the floor, I can tell you the wall behind it definitely was, because they shot themselves with a shotgun and you could see the blast up the wall. Okay? But what else was contaminated? Pretty much everything in that structure had some level of contamination, because you had flies, you had vermin that were carrying pieces all over the place. Okay? So the contamination spread very quickly. So who gets impacted? Well, the family, obviously. Community. And let's not forget about our technicians. Michael talked about volunteers going into hurricanes. When something like this occurs and it's a public setting like a church, the community quite often tries to get involved and come in. Unlike a hurricane where you can prepare somebody for what they're going to go in to clean up, you can't always mentally prepare somebody for what they're going to see when they walk into a trauma loss. Our technicians, people doing the cleaning, that's on the far right-hand side. That was a technician doing the job of that church that I showed you earlier. I've known a lot of technicians that have done this for years, and then, like I say, one day, they just can't do it anymore. Something triggers the wrong way. And we have to prepare for that. We need to have an opportunity for technicians, project managers, people working on these jobs to talk about them and decompress. A lot of companies that do a lot of biohazard cleanup may even have counselors on their staff or contracted with, so that the people have somebody to talk to afterwards. The one thing you don't want your technicians doing is going to the local restaurant, sitting down, having lunch, talking about the trauma job they're doing. They may make humor of it just to try and release the tension, but you don't know who's sitting in the booth next to you and what they hear. So we've always had a policy of you don't talk about the job outside. You only talk about it at the job and in the shop. And again, counseling is not just for the people doing the work. Sometimes it's their family, because they don't understand why Bob goes home and doesn't talk about the jobs that he did. The family can't understand. So sometimes you have to get that counseling a little bit further. If community is involved, obviously that's pretty easy, widespread. We have a lot more contact and get that information out. News crews, unfortunately, flock to these types of scenes. We want to try and minimize that. You want to have respect for the family, respect for the incident that occurred. There we go. One of the first things you always want to think about is, if this is a police scene, has it been cleared by authorities so that you can actually go in and do work? The last thing you want to do is disturb a crime scene and then be responsible for that on the backside. The body is generally removed before we ever get in there. so it's not an issue for you. But look at the scope of impact. What's been impacted? Where did the death occur? Where did the accident occur? Whatever it is. I've seen losses where somebody expired inside the front door and then the entire structure was cleaned when they were found within, a few hours of expiring. Well, there's probably some level of cleaning that needs to be done throughout the structure, but do you need to go to the same degree of cleaning throughout the structure as if somebody started bleeding in one room and walked from room to room after that and tracked blood? That's a different level. So establish your scope, isolate the areas that are impacted. If you can set up containment chambers, if any of you have done any type of mold or any type of environmental cleaning, you know how to do containment chambers. We do a lot of those in this type of work because you want to quadrant off what's been impacted so that it's not spread, and you have an area that you can decontaminate yourself, your equipment, etc., as you're carrying things in and out. Setting up containments, sometimes doing it outside so that the neighborhood can't see what's going on. Again, sensitivity to the neighborhood. In some areas, even having identified vehicles outside is not a good idea because then there's too much evidence of what may have occurred. Gets out in the news, gets out in the neighborhood association talk, whatever it is, but quadrant off the outside, and you notice our outside containment is done in blue just so that nobody can see through it. You don't use clear plastic so people can see you donning and doffing your PPE, etc. Some of these other areas, some of these other pictures, the one in the upper center, you can see those are bread racks, if you can identify what those are. Okay, this was an individual who didn't think he was being paid well enough to work in a restaurant, so he decided to commit suicide in the restaurant. That's the belt laying there on the floor. So he decided to hang himself. He was going to teach him a lesson, so he was going to hang himself. He strapped it up, stood up on top of those bread racks, which were on wheels. So they slipped out from under him. He fell and hit his head and bled. Didn't die, just bled everywhere. Okay? Now, you've got a restaurant, had an employee that's bleeding. Do you want the other employees cleaning that up? No. That's where restoration professionals come in and do the cleaning for you. And that's part of what we need to make sure people understand, the proper training and the proper conditioning. It's not only the products we use, the way we do it, but you want to make sure that the people who are coming in are designed to do it. You don't want to clean up from your buddy who was working and now disgruntled, and because now you're madder. I got to clean up after your mess. Okay? And that was one of the cases. They actually started with having the employees cleaning this up and then realized very quickly it probably wasn't a good idea. If you look on the right-hand side there, see that small bit of blood on the carpet? Remember I said identifying scope of loss. Okay? That is all the blood and body fluids that were in this home. Okay? It wasn't somebody who died. It was just a bodily accident. Okay? That was all the contaminant. So what's your scope of work? Fairly small. So what if I told you that the company came in, tore out all the carpet in the entire house, cleaned all the surfaces multiple times, deodorized, spent 6 days there? Do you think that's an excessive scope of work? Okay? That's what it appears to be. That's why when you identify what the scope is, keep in mind what's truly impacted. Okay? Not, obviously if it had been days and weeks before somebody discovered it, you have a bigger impact, you have odors, etc. If it was immediate, scope of work is much smaller. There we go. Safety. I know Michael talked quite a bit about personal protective and making sure that people are safe when we go into hurricanes. This is even more important when we're doing trauma and crime scene. Gloves, goggles, proper respiratory protection, disposable suits, even the ability to decontaminate your equipment. Now you notice my very expensive and fancy PPE down in that lower left-hand corner. That was the first PPE I used almost 35 years ago, going into my first trauma job. A cigar, some Vicks Vapor Rub, Tiger Balm, one of those two kind of products. Okay? You smoke a cigar because it burns out your taste buds, because if you can't taste, you can't smell. Use the Vicks, plug up your nose, you can't smell anything. I'm here to tell you, I could smell everything. I can't light a cigar and be around Vicks Vapor Rub and not remember that first trauma job. Okay? Triggers a memory day after day. So let's make sure we're using the right equipment, and then decontaminate your equipment when you're done. And unfortunately, or fortunately, we do have to charge for decontamination of our equipment so that we don't cross-contaminate another loss later on. You notice in his hand he's got proper bags, red or blaze orange with the biohazard, but knowing what goes in the red box or red bag. Not every item goes in there, only the items that can release bodily fluids. You may end up tearing out all the carpet because of line of sight, that sort of thing, but it's all the individual spots of the carpet that have to be red bagged. Somebody expires on a sofa, you're not going to put the whole sofa in, you're going to take the soft materials out, put that in the red bag, and take the hard frame, decontaminate it, and have it disposed of. Know what is and isn't. Charges on red bags and disposals are very high. Not uncommon for that part of the bill to be in the thousands of dollars itself, just based on the red bags. Demolition. We're going to have to do some demo. That's that same picture where they cut out the carpet. Any immediate thoughts about that carpet when you see how that's cut out? Remember that? That was that little spot of blood. Okay? Line of sight now. We tore the carpet out in the middle of a room. Guess what has to happen? All the carpet gets replaced. So now you red bag that one area of impact, and yeah, you go a little larger than the actual impact because of the spread underneath, but now we have to remove all the rest of the carpet that's disposed of normally. The floor itself is decontaminated before new carpet is put in. Make sure you set the expectation. How long is it going to take? How quickly are we going to be done? That sort of thing, because it's obviously set up over time. How many of you have copies of the S540? Anybody in the room? I see a couple of hands. Who would like a copy of the S540? All right, lots of hands. You know what? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. If everybody will get out a business card. Kayla, are you in the back? There she is. Okay, I knew she was there at some point. Kayla's with the IICRC. She's going to, when we're done here, if everyone would get out a business card, give it to Kayla. We're going to send you a link and give you access to that standard, an online copy of that standard, just for being here. I was going to do it a different way originally, but I thought, you know, I got a lot of great people. Those of you that are watching online, I'm really sorry. Next time you're going to have to come to the presentation live to get a copy of the standard. Okay. It's important that you get a copy of the standard. You're all familiar with the S500. Somebody referenced the 500, the 520 earlier. This was released in April of 2017. This is the newest standard that we've released. It is a consensus body standard. It was worked on for a couple of years. Wonderful document. There is no reference guide with it, it's just the standard. If you're familiar with the S500, we had the standard and the reference guide. We've gone to just doing the standard at this point in all of our documents as we go through the ANSI process. And I'm also excited to tell you that this past weekend we approved our new trauma course through the IICRC. They're in the process of running some beta tests on our exam, and those courses will be coming out probably late fourth quarter, early first quarter of next year, so you can take a 2-day trauma and crime scene cleanup course through the IICRC and get continuing education credits. We've been working with the ABRA Association. I don't know if there's anyone here from ABRA. There we go. We've been working with ABRA to kind of join together and work together on not only the standard as they contributed, but on that educational market so we can continue to drive it forward as well. Because as an industry, we need to get the word out that this type of work needs to be done by professionals. Quite often the coroners get involved, the first responders, but we as restoration professionals are the ones who go in and do the cleanup. We just finished a conference last weekend in Vegas, IICRC Tech Conference, on trauma cleanup. Had about 180 people there learning how to do trauma and crime scene. And a lot of them were not from the restoration industry. They were from other industries, excuse me, first responders, et cetera, because they wanted to understand what the process is about. So that's why I'm happy to, Michael, I'm glad you walked back in. Michael, I'm going to make sure you get this copy right here. I gave everybody else an electronic copy, but I'm going to hand you this one when we're done. I've known Michael a long time. He's a great educator. I took a couple classes from you myself over the years. So what about the cleanup? What about the claim side of the process? And as I said, I'm not an adjuster, but there's some information that you need to understand that they consider when they look at a claim. They're going to look at what are some of the things that are being handled in the biohazard. Okay? They're going to look at the potential, is it covered? How often do we get the call for a biohazard and then we discover it's not, or the homeowner discovers it's not covered by their insurance? But it still has to be cleaned up, right? And even did their insurance look at it correctly? Because there's different areas to understand. It's a difficult claim situation from the insurance side. As I worked on a presentation like this for the at PLRB a couple of years ago with somebody from a claim side, his recommendation was it's very difficult for people to even identify whether it's covered and what components and what they look at it. You know, they're looking at, you know, death, major injuries, the emotional atmosphere, mental challenges, and then all that preparing that we talk about. But from the insurance side, they didn't understand that all has to play into the invoice. They have to get paid for it some way because we're taking care of the customer on the backside. Here's some misconceptions with biohazards from the insurance side. Now, I'm going to tell you, this slide was written by an insurance professional, not by me. So he wrote these out and said, all situations need to be treated the same. How many of you have ever done water loss? Ever been to a training center that has what we call a flood house or an ASD house? Okay. Well, at ServiceMaster we have one. It's been flooded 170 plus times the number of years we've had it. I can guarantee you it doesn't dry the same way every time. And yet we flood it the same way because we flood it to a set of guidelines. So what makes you think the two trauma losses are going to be the same? And so the insurance company says, just wipe a little, you know, soap on it, put some bleach on it, it'll be just fine. Okay, that's not the case. The other misconception is when something is contaminated, everything needs to be destroyed. Really? So we're going to come in and tear everything out in the house? What if it's ceramic tile? Do I need to tear it out or can I disinfect it? Carpeting? Soft goods? Okay. But hard surfaces? I may be able to clean those. Okay. And you know what? All cleaning protocols are the same. Just anything will work. The other thing the insurance company looks at is that the fees are very excessive. Trauma losses are much higher cost than a water loss. Absolutely. But do they need to be 10 and 15 times the cost of a water loss? Probably not. We need to control that even within our own industry to make sure that what we're doing is reasonable. All in all, it comes down to what can be cleaned, what can't be cleaned, has to be removed. Okay. Several types, we talked about these a little bit: crime scenes, suicide, homicides, bodily fluids, etc. Animals are becoming more and more a big issue in biohazard and more looked at by the insurance industry because they're not really sure what to do with animals. You know, we look at insurance policies, there's one basic clause that's always in insurance policies that say sudden and incidental, right? It's covered because it was sudden and incidental. If you have a house that's infected with bats, living in the attics, living in the rafters, whatever it is that sudden and incidental? So the insurance company says, oh, well, therefore it's not covered. That's not always true. They need look at it even themselves, that sometimes they go, well, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We have to look at it a different way. Is it an area that, look at churches. How often do you have steeples that may have bats in them or something living there? Nobody ever goes in the steeple. How would they know? It's not a maintenance issue. It's an area that nobody is occupying. What about food spoilage and contamination? Okay. We've all done those losses where the power went out, the refrigerator was full of food, and somebody decided to open the refrigerator a week later. It's another smell you'll never forget. Okay? But you know what? That's a biohazard, because all that food spoilage is now a contaminant that we have to deal with. This is a coverage section. I'm not going to read you this. Okay, this is better than Michael's eye test on the fine print. But based on policy's definition of pollutants, that's the part I want to get to you. The bodily fluid. Are those things a pollutant? Because that's where the insurance company looks at it from a coverage, non-coverage standpoint. Is it covered because it's a pollutant or not? Okay? And we have to keep that in mind of whether the policy covers pollution, things that are contaminated and discharged. The idea, we think of pollution as waste, but pollutants are anything that are expelled and transferred somewhere else. Something that's not supposed to be there. Okay? And that's where we have to start thinking about it from the insurance policy standpoint of what is a pollutant, what's sudden and incidental, and what goes on. Now, the fact that in most cases when we're dealing with biohazards, it is sudden and incidental. If somebody cuts themselves, somebody dies, etc., that is sudden and incidental, but then it's the pollutant side and then the coverage side. There's also some policy exclusions that have to be considered. Not only looking at it from blood and fecal matter, bodily fluids as a pollutant, but was the discharge or seepage or the leakage the pollutant that caused the named peril under the homeowner's form or specified cause of loss under the BP and CP forms. Okay? Those are insurance terms. Was it sudden and incidental? Was it intentional? Was the discharge due to vandalism? The person was shot or stabbed in a robbery. Was the discharge due to an explosion? A gunshot is an explosion, folks. We don't think about that. But a lot of our homeowner policies have exclusions for explosion. Do you know that? How many of us have read our homeowner's policy word for word? I didn't see a single hand move. That's a little scary. You might want to go back and read your homeowner's policy. Look at the exclusions. Explosions are excluded in many policies, and a gunshot is considered an explosion. An intentional act exclusion. This is another insurance policy exclusion. In general, for the intentional loss exclusion to apply, the act causing the loss must meet two criteria. It was committed by or at the direction of the insured. Okay? It was committed with the intent to cause a loss. Okay, so it's pretty easy to think if I set my house on fire, it's going to be excluded, right? If I come in there with gasoline and a match and set my house on fire, that's going to be excluded. I own the home, I intentionally did it, I was trying to cause a loss, that's excluded. But what if the insured committed suicide by shooting themselves? Is that going to get excluded? What if one of the insureds attempts to kill another in the home? Was it at the direction or act of the insured? Yeah, both of those are. Was it at the committed with the intent to cause a loss? That's where it gets questionable sometimes for the insurance. If they committed suicide, was it at the intent to cause a loss or just to take their own life? Generally, they're not thinking about damaging their structure, they're thinking about killing themselves. Okay? This is something, and again, I'm not an insurance professional. I encourage you to talk to people in the insurance industry and get with them, read your own policy, see where those exclusions are to understand that. because this is the area, the gray area that we run into quite often on policies. And it is different between commercial and personal lines or residential insurance. Okay, they're covered completely different. I mentioned the church earlier with the deer. Okay. Quite often, the way churches are insured depends upon the church. They fall more towards the personal lines style of insurance than they do the commercial line. That particular one with the deer was an uncovered loss by the insurance company because of some of their exclusions that they had. Now, did that matter? No, it still needed to be cleaned up. It happened on a Friday. They wanted to be ready for services on Sunday, and they were. Okay? But then the discussion comes about, well, who's paying for it? How are we paying for it? It's not covered, etc. So knowing your exclusions. Some of the other exclusions or coverage questions: discharge, dispersal, seepage, migration, release, or escape of pollutants, unless it's caused by a covered peril. So in other words, if somebody expires sitting on the couch and the bodily fluids seep down and go through a floor, that's a pollutant, it's an escape. But what if it goes through the floor and it's another homeowner below? Apartment, condo, that sort of thing. Now you've got different insurance coverages, different people that are being covered in different ways. Make sure you understand what's being dealt with. This is why when we go into these types of losses, this is not a one-person job. Okay? Number one, with the mental side of it, I always recommend you send a minimum of 2, preferably 3 technicians, and you may have to have one person that does nothing but deal with the contract, the insurance, those types of people, type of the loss, to make sure it's covered and they're not involved in the actual cleaning. Separate the emotional sides. The other thing that will get excluded is wear and tear. Okay? Well, that's where the bats, the animals living in areas, become wear and tear and excluded in the coverage, where they say, well, you didn't maintain it. It's been deteriorating for a number of years, and now you have wear and tear involved. And so, yes, we're going to cover this part of the cleanup, but it gets reduced, the amount that's covered, because of the wear and tear. Make sure you understand all those components as you get into it. There we go. Animal losses. Again, I've touched on these a couple of times. Most policies have some exclusion for losses caused by certain types of animals. Obviously, a deer jumping through your window is not a norm. They don't expect that. It wasn't the deer that was the exclusion part. It had to do with some other parts on that policy that caused the other exclusions. But raccoons, mice, those types of vermin going into losses are what quite often excluded, because that is maintenance. Those are things that people should be paying attention to. Nesting, infestations, commercial forms especially will have exclusions for those types from birds, insects, rodents. Damage to home can be caused over a period of time. Remember that. Pets having accidents. Little Fifi. Did you ever notice always the little dogs that had the problems? Never the big dog. It's always a little dog. My little Fifi would never go to the bathroom in the house. Really? Okay. We tear up the carpet. We find all the stains. Is that a biohazard? Absolutely. And it needs to be treated like one, especially when they're trying to sell the home. Okay, it becomes a bigger problem. Food spoilage. I touched on that a little bit earlier. Whether it was from power outages, power failure, utility services in commercial. What about hoarders? Okay. We talk about food spoilage and biohazard. Hey, you go into a hoarder's loss, and we've seen several of them. Okay. There's generally food spoilage, there's rodents, etc. Are they covered? I've had to deal with insurance companies because of those types of losses who've said, well, we're going to clean up from the water loss. We got called in because it was a water loss, but all that other stuff we're not going to cover. But we have to get rid of all that other stuff to deal with the water loss. And so it becomes a big conversation about what's sudden and incidental, what's covered, what's not covered. Is the food spoilage, the fact that there's, mice or rats running all over the place, and I have to call an exterminator before I can even get started to clean up from the water loss. And if I don't clean up from the water loss, what am I going to have later? Mold. So as soon as you say mold to an insurance company, what happens? Oh, that's not covered. Well, it is, because I couldn't get to the water loss because you wouldn't let me do these parts. And so it becomes a big conversation. When does that conversation need to occur, though? Before you start. Get an understanding. Get your scope of work laid out clearly before you ever start the loss. The worst thing you can do is get into the job and then find out, oh, we're not going to cover, we're not going to do this. And then you find out there's no money from the homeowner, from whoever, etc. You're restoration professionals, we need to be compensated as well, but we need to do it the right way. So remediation cost. Well, typical water job, $2,000, $3,000. Typical fire with contents and some building mitigation. This isn't build back, neither of these. $4,000 to $8,000. Okay. What about biohazard? $10,000, $20,000, $40,000. Okay. But are we talking about claims that are being mitigated properly? How should they be billed? There are line items in software programs, whichever program you use, that talk about biohazard cleanup. They don't cover what we need to be compensated at. We need to look at those carefully. Most biohazard and traumas are really billed as time and material. And if you don't understand time and material billing, it is completely different than using Xactimate, Symbility, one of those types of products, and using line items. When you go in and start billing for every person, every cleaning towel, every product, every item, keeping track of PPE, keeping track of every item you're using, that's time and material billing. Set up those rates in advance, and that's the best way to make sure you're covered with a reasonable scope of loss. Okay? Setting up the scope starts it, and then setting up a consistent billing practice on the back end ties it all together for you. We never want to go in and say, oh, there's a little blood inside the front door, and now I've got a $40,000 loss. Okay? The one where you saw that carpet torn out, that little spot of carpet, when I got the invoice on it, it was over $40,000 for that home. The mitigation cost, not the build back, the mitigation charges. $40,000. Does that sound reasonable? When you looked at a picture and saw blood about the size of this book. Okay? That's where our industry has to be careful, and we have to be reasonable. Yes, we have to be compensated for what we do. That's why the standard was written, though, folks, to explain what the process should be and how to get through it, and how to set up the scope of work, what pictures should be taken. You go into a water loss, you take pictures today. You go into a fire loss, you take pictures. Should you take pictures on a trauma loss? Absolutely. Be very careful what you do with those pictures, though. Unlike a water loss, you're dealing with potentially a loss of life. Sensitivity is a much greater concern. Okay? Photos are important so that people can see what was done, where did things start, what has to be done on the back end, okay? But not just to take pictures. All right, come on. So what's some of our cleanup protocols? All right, hard surfaces can be cleaned. Talked about that before. Some of the very similar processes that Michael talked about, the Pittsburgh Protocol, foaming, agitation, cleaning. Okay, folks, we're in the cleaning business when you get down to it. Okay, making sure you understand how to do cleaning. Disposal areas that may not be able to be cleaned, you may have to cut out drywall that's got direct impact, but you'll also have carpet that will be removed, soft goods, bedding. If somebody expires on the bed, are you going to take the whole mattress, put it in a red bag? Probably not. You're going to take all the soft components out of it, red bag that, dispose of it, etc. Provide PPE in isolation areas within the structure, and then your disposal requirements. Know your local, state, federal laws related to removing the items. Are you a hazardous waste hauler? In most states, you have to be licensed to move these types of products. That's why there's companies out there that's what they do. License with the companies, get it moved as it should be. Follow your OSHA compliance, there's bloodborne pathogen training, etc. EPA gets involved at some level on what products, the licensing of your products, etc., as well as your state environmental compliance. Get it certified. You may, if it's a commercial structure, you may have to have the surfaces, especially if they're restaurants, have them clean certified before they can be reused. A lot of times with restaurants, we just tell the restaurant to follow their normal food contact surface cleaning after we've done all of our cleaning so that they're back in their process. Reporting is your photos, etc., that we've talked about it. Sensitivity training for those impacted as well as your workers is all part of your job. Okay? At the end of the job, you're going to have to let people decompress and talk about what they saw and make sure that people are dealt with properly. It's a very stressful situation. Okay? From the claims handling side, photo documentation, photos of everything that was before it was done, after it was removed. Photograph all of your red bags, all of your things that are going into red bags or red boxes. Make sure you take photographs of that. Diagram not only the structure, where the loss occurred, and what had to be disposed of, and what impacted areas are dealt with, so that you have, again, photo documentation through diagrams. And then your PPE. You're going to use a lot of PPE on a trauma loss. A lot at the very beginning, once you get it decontaminated and you get down to cleaning, once you've done the major disinfection, your PPE requirements start to drop. You don't necessarily need respirators at the end. Stay within the confines of the S540. That's always your backup. If you have questions about it, I suggest you get to a trauma training class. Understand, either go through one of the ABRA classes or through the IICRC. Find out about the training classes that are out there for you. Comply with OSHA. I'm not going to try and give you all the OSHA regulations, but I will tell you that most people say, oh, I've been through bloodborne pathogen training, I know all about trauma. No, you don't. Bloodborne pathogen training is just a surface of what trauma is all about, because that's designed for basic blood. Okay? Make sure you're doing an adequate accounting of time involved in the remediation. Again, that's that time and materials, and be able to explain why you tore out what you did. Those are all components of every loss in the claims handling process. So again, there's no average recovery when we come to biohazard. Okay? Safety is your priority. Remember universal precaution, assume everything is contaminated, your OPIMs before you do it, and make sure you deal with sensitivity and confidentiality on every loss. I'm getting the signal from the back. I know we've got some questions, and I believe we're going to take some of our online questions first.
Okay, does anybody in this room have questions? We're going to start there and see if our online audience has a few. Yes.
You mentioned post-testing. Would you recommend ATP testing for this?
ATP testing gives you an indicator. It does not necessarily give you clear, complete clearance testing. Depends upon the loss, depends upon what you're doing. Unfortunately, my answer is it depends. It's a good indicator. I like ATP for an indication of what's occurred. Keep in mind that that only looks at viable. If you swab dried blood with an ATP meter, quite often it comes up 0. Does that mean it's not contaminated? So keep that in mind as you're looking at ATP. Make sure you really understand ATP before you utilize it.
What kind of testing would you recommend then?
Again, depends upon where the loss occurred, what I'm dealing with. If I'm dealing with a school, if I'm dealing with hospitals, et cetera, quite often I'll call in an environmental professional and have them, a third-party certified test behind me. They'll do biological testing, swabbing.
You mentioned insurance, and I think in most cases, many of us are familiar with dealing with homeowners insurance. But in cases like this, it seems like it could be auto, personal, rental, life. Who is the point person to manage those different organizations?
That's a great question. So you mentioned auto insurance, homeowner insurance. Life insurance doesn't fall into this. Unfortunately, some life insurance policies have an exclusion for suicide. Okay? A lot of people don't even remember that. But auto insurance, your auto insurance, your home insurance, which one? You're going to start with where did it occur, which policy is involved, and start through the process. If you're lucky, their homeowner and their auto were from the same company, and if they died, maybe they died in their car, in their garage. Well, is that their auto insurance or is that their homeowner insurance? Again, I'm not an insurance professional, so start the questions, ask the questions of the insurance companies to see where it's being covered. Okay?
Hey, Pete, I just wanted to, instead of a question, I just wanted to add one other point there. You're saying you're not going to get into all the OSHA stuff. But as a safety professional, I just wanted to share this one. I got a call just a little while ago. It was a trauma scene. They had done what I considered to be a pretty good job on the trauma scene, but as part of that, they had to cut out some of the subfloor. And then one of the employees actually, as they were doing final cleaning, they hadn't put any sort of barricade around the hole in the floor and dropped into the basement and ended up breaking some bones, going to the hospital. And it was 7 weeks later that they got the OSHA inspection because got into the hospital, and then those records eventually, because it was a workplace accident, got to the OSHA and everything. So, sometimes it's a simple stuff. They did all of the biohazard stuff really well, but didn't put a barricade around a hole that they cut in the floor.
Yeah, we quite often forget about OSHA, especially in homes. We think, oh, OSHA can't show up, it's a home. Well, you're working there, now it's a commercial site. So OSHA does apply. Michael, that's a great point. Barricades around the hole in the floor to make sure that the workers are protected. Remember, basically, I always explain it this way. The EPA protects the environment, the OSHA protects employees. Okay? And we're the owner of the business in between. We have to look at both sides.
Okay, it does look like we have an online question, so I'm going to throw it back to Ian, who's going to ask the online question.
Okay.
Hey, Pete. Are infrared lights good for detecting blood and other bodily fluids, and OPIMs to look at potentially affected areas?
So are infrared lights good for detecting OPIM, blood and bodily fluids? In some cases, yes. It will give you an indicator, and there are products, we're not CSI, we're not the crime scene folks. There are products that you can spray that help them effervesce, that you can see them a little bit better. But a basic infrared light, it has to be pretty high intensity so that you can see the reflection, and that's what you're looking for. But I will caution you, because you can also get false readings from cleaning products, especially household products that have optical brighteners, because they reflect from that same light. So know what you're looking at. Again, don't use them for the first time on the job. It's kind of like your ATP meter. Make sure you understand it, you're tested, and you practice with it before you ever get there.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. We have one more?
We have one more, or are we good?
No? Okay. I think we're good. Thank you, Pete. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Pete, a round of applause.